but there are also groups back home in Guyana who are concerned about the management of the funds or how the funds are being distributed. 85% for climate adaptation, but a designated 15% for indigenous communities because they are the custodians of the forest. There are concerns that the indigenous people might not have been adequately consulted with before, and these are their lands. There are concerns that that 15% may not be a figure they would have agreed to. They might have wanted more. So it's not that Ghana has this perfect plan and it's doing the very best. There are things to work out, and I think part of what Ghana is doing here is showing what it's doing, but also answering those questions that come up.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Caribbean Climate Calabash. My name is Hippolyto Novello, and I'm with Vishani Ragobeer, one of the CT Fellows for Cop28. And what we'll discuss today is how our experience has been at Cop28. So, tell us, how has it been so far?
Thank you, Hippolyto. It's about a few days into COP. We're not yet quite at the halfway stage. For me personally, I've been really enjoying my experience here at COP28. A huge part of why I'm enjoying the experience is because I guess I have this sort of direct access to my officials right now, but I also have direct access to experts who I wouldn't have been able, or I don't think I would have been able to access from back home in Ghana. So because of that direct access to both sets of persons, I've been able to to write some really comprehensive, or what I believe are comprehensive, in-depth stories about Ghana's ventures here at the climate talks.
Yeah, and one of your key focus will be the forest in Guyana.
Yeah.
I think you had mentioned in one of your stories that Guyana wants climate finances to protect its forests because forests traps carbon, and that's important when it comes to fighting climate change. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, sure. So a lot of people who don't know about Ghana are really impressed here when I tell them that 85% of Ghana's entire landmass is just covered by forests. And that's about 18.5 million hectares of forest. And we've protected those forests for years. But what our leaders have been arguing for a very long time is that we don't really get compensation for protecting those forests that trap carbon, that contribute to saving the earth. So what they've been pushing since 2009 is sort of a payment scheme to get compensation for protecting those forests. Now, we got a deal in 2009 with Norway, but since then there hasn't been much happening up until last year when we signed a deal with an oil company, the Hess Corporation, to get payments for carbon credits, which is essentially they're giving us money on a voluntary basis so that we can not cut down our trees for like agriculture or mining, for example. So we protect the trees and we protect the biodiversity that exists there. And we also provide funds to some of the indigenous peoples because they have a harmonic relationship with those forests and the natural environment.
So let us see if I get it straight, right? So basically, big polluter countries causing this problem with Guyana and Belize that they're facing the brunt of climate change. Now, Guyana has over 80% of its forest intact, right? So that forest traps carbon, which is one of the solutions for battling climate change. Now, mind you, Guyana is facing the brunt of climate change, one caused by big polluter countries, and its forest is helping solve the climate crisis. So why is it that Guyana should pay for that? I think that's the country's position, right? In terms of trying to get climate finances from big polluter countries like the US, UK, and India. And like you mentioned, I think Guyana plays a leading role in the region in terms of the carbon market, because even Belize is still a new phase that Belize is trying to get through with our chickable forest and our part of the biosphere there in Belize. What are some of the reactions you've been getting so far from the people that you've been speaking to and the experts?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the things that really struck me, that really made an impression on me for the people who are not from Ghana, is that they're just amazed by the sheer size of our forest and how we've been able to protect that for years. But interestingly, they're also interested in our model for the carbon market. So we have what's called a jurisdictional model. So instead of small patches being used for projects, the entire country's forest is covered under one carbon credit scheme, so to speak. So it's a national sort of coverage. And with that, we're able to get funds on a national basis. And the scheme involves whatever funds come in, 85% goes to climate adaptation. And as you mentioned, Ghana is a particularly vulnerable country. We're at the edge of South America, for those who don't know. On our coastline, where about 90% of our people live and work, is below sea level. It's about 6 to 7 feet below sea level. So that means rising sea levels can devastate us, which it has in the
Mm-hmm.
past. We've had big floods in 2005 and in 2021, huge floods. So our argument has been that, we are particularly vulnerable to climate change. And for years, we've been protecting these forests that help to save the earth from climate change. So we want to get paid. A lot of people find that interesting. A lot of people think that's necessary. And I think this year, particularly, there's a lot of focus also on forest protection and reducing deforestation. I mean, you see big people like the president of Brazil, President Lula, talking about the need for funds to protect the Amazon, and Ghana is part of that Amazon as well. So a lot of people are interested in what Ghana is doing and the model Ghana is going after, because we're still hammering out the details of carbon markets around the world. But Ghana was the first country to get this sort of jurisdictional model to push that. But I will say, it isn't without concerns, Hippolito. There are people who are concerned about Ghana essentially putting its credits in the voluntary market when we still haven't fully fleshed out all the nitty gritties of everything. But there are also groups back home in Ghana who are concerned about the management of the funds or how the funds are being distributed. 85% for climate adaptation, but a designated 15% for indigenous
Mm-hmm.
communities because they are the custodians of the forest. There are concerns that the indigenous people might not have been adequately consulted with before, and these are their lands. There are concerns that that 15% may not be a figure they would have agreed to. They might have wanted more. So it's not that Ghana has this perfect plan and it's doing the very best. There are things to work out, and I think part of what Ghana is doing here is showing what it's doing, but also answering those questions that come up.
Yeah, and I totally agree that the indigenous people play a crucial role, and I think that they need to be included more when it comes to conversation like this. But let's look at the other side of the coin. I know in one of your articles, you spoke about or the perception of hypocrisy when it comes to the exploration of oil and gas found off the coast of Guyana, and I think the President Ali responded to that assertion. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so we had a side event right here at Cop28. And let's be frank for a second, oil and gas is bad. Fossil fuels are bad for the environment. But sort of the position of the government now that it's pushing its forest protection plans is that, listen, for years we've been providing this service. We have needs, we need money. So why should you stop us from getting money through a way that we can get money? That is oil and gas and also the carbon market. But interestingly, another point that was raised by the Vice President, Dr. Barajaglia, is that the sheer size of our forests with the oil and gas production that we're doing, even at peak production, which should be about 1.6 million barrels of oil per day, that is some years by the end of the decade, the forest that we have would trap more carbon than is produced. Now, of course, that doesn't account for trapping carbon that's produced elsewhere, but he's saying this is our responsibility. This is what we're responsible for, and we will be able to offset more than what we are producing. So that's an interesting conversation. I think that's something a lot of people are interested in. That's something I'm personally
Yeah.
interested in. That whole sort of responsibility, the sort of, I guess, climate justice approach to it, because Ghana has needs. Ghana needs money, and it isn't getting money, so it's doing what it can to get that money.
Okay, so let's get into why is it important for you as a journalist from Guyana to have a voice to tell your stories from the Caribbean in an international stage like this.
Yeah, sure thing. I think the first and most important thing is because we just don't see enough of our stories. And for whatever reason that is, maybe our stories aren't attractive enough, it doesn't appeal to as many people, so the big agencies won't cover it, or it's maybe not controversial enough. For whatever reason, our stories just aren't told enough. But Guyana and other Caribbean states, we're small island developing states, we are vulnerable to the climate crisis. And there's no question about it. I don't think anybody's questioning that. We are particularly vulnerable. So I believe it's important for us to tell our stories, because we have to show people how we are affected. Because who else will? Who else is going to come and give us money if they don't know what we are facing? So for me, the biggest part, or the biggest focus for me, and the most important thing for me, is authentically telling our stories. And that doesn't mean positioning our countries as the best or whatever. It just means telling our stories authentically. And I think people in the region who have these lived experiences are the best people to do that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Vishani. And remind us again where we can read your stories.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Polito. So my stories are published at the Newsroom Guyana, which is a privately owned company in Guyana. We have a website, newsroom.gy, and we're on all social media platforms. And you can also read my stories on Climate Tracker.
Yeah, so that's climatetracker.org, and this has been another edition of Caribbean Climate Calabash podcast. I'm Hippolyta with Vishani. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.